Who has heard the term means of grace as a way to talk about the spiritual disciplines before? All right. So some traditions talk about the disciplines in maybe more palatable terms. It's like, if you don't like that word, well, let's talk about the means of grace. And here's what it means. God's grace pours out through specific ways. And when we receive them, by cooperating with him and participating with him, we receive the means of grace. So, for example, communion is a means of grace. Fellowship, confession, solitude, silence, prayer, all these are means of grace. In other words, it's the way through which God pours out his grace. And I think that that's a great way to think about it, because God invites us into his life. I love how Dallas Willard talks about this. He says, grace is not opposed to effort, but to earning. God's grace is not opposed to our effort, but it is opposed to our earning. In other words, we do exert effort when we cooperate with God, when we align our hearts with God. It's a process, but we don't earn anything. And so let me describe it in terms of an analogy. The first analogy I want to use is an oasis in the desert, okay? So take my Yeti, because people bring Yetis to the desert, and you're walking around, right? It's arid, it's dry, all you see is sand as far as you can see, and you are parched. And then you become dangerously thirsty, and then on the horizon you see greenery. And so it's like, oh my goodness, and you find out it's an oasis. And so you go to this oasis, and you find there's water there that's making the plants live. And so you're like, oh my goodness, this is perfect. I'm going to fill up my water here and I'm going to drink it. Right? Well, spiritually speaking, going to the oasis is going to the means of God's grace in a dry and weary land. And here's the good news. God's grace is predictable. His oases are fixed. We just have to find where they are and go to them repeatedly. Here's a sci-fi version of that. It's another analogy. Pretend that God's grace is an ocean of water expanding in all directions over your head with a glass ceiling, okay? And he wants to pour it out. And he's got these fountains of water flowing out of this massive reservoir of water that pour out in these streams, right? These cylinders of his grace. A little psychedelic, right? It's a little different. Well, if that's God's grace, all we have to do is fill up. And it's like, wow, there's water in here. This is amazing. And then you walk over here and it's like, oh, prayer. That's how I can receive God's grace. Fasting? Now that's kind of weird, but wow. It's a means of grace. Confession? Man, that's good. God's grace is waiting to pour out through specific means, but here's what a lot of people do spiritually. It's like, man, where's God? And the water's just gushing like right here. And they're like, that's not my style. I don't really connect with that. Then, they put it out and there's some dew in the morning, but it's like, I can't. People, there's a group of people that I don't know who taught them this, but the only way that they connect with God is out in the woods by themselves. They're like, church just isn't for me. I connect with God. I just feel God when I'm in the woods. It's like, cool. Like, me too. It's called solitude and connect with God in nature. But if that's your only spiritual means of grace, it's like, dude, you are totally missing out. You guys tracking with me? Does means of grace make sense? So in other words, God is not elusive. He's got specific ways that we can connect with him. And to me, that's super liberating. We don't have to wonder, will that oasis be there? Will this flood of his water in the form of a fountain go away? And here's the thing. Sometimes it's more like a drip. At least it feels that way. But it's still there. And so what I want to say is, think about your walk with God in terms of, first, alignment with his heart. In other words, we align our hearts with his as we move toward him, and then he changes us. That's how it works. And here's the thing, it's never going to change. God fixed the way the world works through the Logos, his eternal Son, and it will never change. It will always be through the means of God's grace as he ordained before the creation of the world. So it's like, if that, might as well get on board now, because tell you what, it is a ride, and it is the ride of a lifetime.